In just 7 frantic minutes in the first-class cabin, a black woman was humiliated. Her car burned to the ground right before the police, losing everything. And then, she made the powerful tremble and beg as she unleashed brutal revenge. But what price does justice come at when blood has been shed, and the whole world wants her dead? The first-class cabin door opened, and a poised black woman stepped inside. Isabel Morrow didn't stand out much, except for the quiet confidence in every step she took. She wore a simple brown jacket, casual trousers, and old leather shoes, yet exuded a distinctive air about her. No need for flashiness. Her bright eyes scanned the cabin as if she were already accustomed to the stares of others upon her. The passengers around her turned to look, some glancing briefly before resuming their business. But then, the scream of a man shattered the calm. "She doesn't belong here." The scream not only made the atmosphere in the cabin go still, but also shifted the curious and unfriendly gazes toward Isabel. It was the voice of Richard Sinclair, a middle-aged white man in an elegant suit sitting in a first-class seat, clearly a person of wealth and power. He couldn't contain his hatred at seeing Isabel walk in. Unlike the others around her, there was no casualness in his gaze, but a palpable sense of injustice radiating from his eyes. "She doesn't belong here." Richard shouted it again, his tone filled with anger and contempt, almost unable to mask the hatred in each word he spoke. He didn't stop there, looking around, his face flushed with fury. "This is first class, not a place for her." Isabel stood in the center of the cabin, not rushing to react. She could feel the stares from the surrounding passengers, the suspicion, the discontent. But instead of showing fear or hesitation, Isabel simply took another step into the cabin, her eyes locking with Richard's, calm and unflinching. The cabin fell silent in a strange way. The entire space seemed engulfed by an unexplained tension, as if everyone was waiting to see what Isabel would do next. "Did you say I don't belong here?" Isabel's voice broke the silence, sharp as a blade, unwavering with every word she spoke. It seemed to cleanse the air of the insult that hung over it. Richard stared at her, his anger rising. He didn't want to back down in front of a black woman, someone he felt didn't deserve to be there. But Isabel's gaze didn't waver. On the contrary, she stepped closer to him, intensifying the tension in the cabin. "Do you even know where you are?" Richard asked, his voice still mocking. "Don't you see that you don't deserve any of this?" Isabel didn't respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her hand and gently touched her handbag, then spoke in a cold tone, as though she had grown used to this kind of discrimination. "I deserve to be here, not because of money or power, but because I can stand firm in the face of people like you." A sense of curiosity and anticipation stirred within the passengers around them. They couldn't take their eyes off the confrontation. They wondered what Isabel would do next. A wealthy, powerful man had just publicly insulted her, but Isabel didn't show any fear. On the contrary, her resilience seemed to grow stronger, making everyone feel her unwavering strength. In this moment, amidst the quiet of the cabin, Isabel created an unspoken change, an indescribable feeling. Injustice and anger rose, not just from her, but from everyone around her. At that moment, a flight attendant stepped forward. Her gaze was soft as she looked toward Isabel, then Richard. The tension in the air made both of them silent for a moment. "I'm sorry, but you can't continue acting like this," the attendant said gently. Her voice was still respectful toward Isabel, but unmistakably stern toward Richard. And then she stood still, needing no further words. She had created a space where the situation wasn't just about the insult from one passenger, but about an invisible battle of discrimination, defiance, and ultimately, an acknowledgement that her presence there wasn't because of wealth or fame, but because she truly belonged. The tension didn't just explode in the cabin. It stirred something within each passenger, an awakening to the injustice they had silently accepted. Richard's words echoed through the cabin, but he didn't stop there. With a tone dripping with disdain, he continued his verbal assault on Isabel. "Don't you see? Did you wander in here from the cargo hold?" Richard sneered, his face spreading into a smile as if he had just said something clever and amusing. Passengers around them started exchanging glances, some unable to hide their curiosity. A few eyes lingered on Isabel, as if waiting for her to react to his endless insults. "You know," Richard went on, his voice smug, "people like you should stay where you belong, not here. I'm sure you've mistaken the cabin." Each word he spoke felt like a knife slicing through the quiet of the plane, striking Isabel's dignity and self-worth. Although everyone heard his every word, no one seemed ready to speak up in her defense. They sat in silence, as if this situation had nothing to do with them. Isabel stood in the middle of the cabin, her face expressionless. Her eyes flashed briefly, maybe a sign of the tremor she felt deep within, but she immediately regained her composure. No tears, no signs of frustration. She remained silent. In the cabin, all eyes were on her. The focus had shifted from a mere exchange between Richard and Isabel to a silent battle between insult and resilience. Isabel didn't speak. There was no clear resistance from her, just a silence that challenged everyone around her. At that moment, a flight attendant hurried over, her steps quick. She couldn't look directly at Richard, but her gaze toward Isabel was filled with understanding and respect. However, she could not ignore the demands of the wealthy passenger. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had become frozen, an overwhelming sense of awkwardness permeating every corner of the plane. Everything seemed to pause. Only the sound of passengers' soft sighs broke the silence as they witnessed this unfolding scene. While Isabel didn't respond, her silence only made the glares from the surrounding passengers feel sharper. The flight attendant looked at Isabel, her expression uncertain, as if she were torn between doing the right thing and pleasing the wealthy passenger. Finally, she sighed and lowered her head, unable to ignore Richard's demands. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I will have to ask you to leave the first-class cabin. It's the airline's policy." Her voice was soft, yet it felt like a slap to Isabel's face. Each word seemed like a direct stab to Isabel's self-respect. Isabel didn't speak. She simply stood there, her sharp eyes locked onto the flight attendant, not out of anger, but out of deep disappointment. She never expected these people to stand up for her, but she didn't anticipate their silence turning into indifference. They didn't just turn their backs on her. They pushed her out of the cabin, despite the fact that she was a valued customer. As the flight attendant asked her to leave, the gazes of the other passengers became critical. All they saw was a black woman, dressed simply, being forced to leave the first-class cabin with no defense. This wasn't just humiliation, it was blatant injustice. Though no one spoke up, their silence still made Isabel feel like an outsider in this world. But there was more to the story, something Isabel knew that no one in the cabin could even begin to imagine. Her secret was not just that she was a black woman. She was the secret owner of the very airline. No one, not the passengers nor the flight attendants, had a clue. Isabel had chosen to keep her identity hidden, not revealing the truth about who she truly was. Here she was, a woman not standing out in flashy clothes or seeking attention, yet she was the one who owned the entire airline. She was the one with the final say on everything, even the smallest matters like this. But no one knew that. Isabel chose not to reveal her identity, and it was this silence that led her to be humiliated, treated no differently than someone without power. As the flight attendant asked her to leave, the passengers continued whispering about her, some shrugging, others glancing at each other and smiling as if they had just witnessed an entertaining event. Yet none of them knew that the person they were mocking was the very one who built the empire they were relying on to travel across the skies. That morning, the boardroom of the airline suddenly became eerily quiet. Even the smallest sounds, the fall of a pen, the rustle of paper, felt like nails driven into the tense air. Conversation ceased, and all eyes were fixed on the door as she entered. Isabel walked in with a steady demeanor, dressed in a simple suit that radiated confidence. Her hair fell naturally, and her cold, determined gaze was fixed ahead. She didn't need lavish clothing or expensive accessories. What she had was far more valuable: power and intelligence, qualities that no one could deny. The room, once a place for like-minded discussions, now felt like a high-stakes stage where glances revealed discontent and suspicion. The CEO, who had once deemed her unworthy, who had openly criticized her just the day before, now sat at the head of the table wearing a smirk. His mocking grin wasn't just condescension, it was an invisible insult dripping down onto her. "Who do you think you are, sitting here?" The CEO's voice rang out, sharp as a blade. He looked at Isabel with eyes full of contempt, as though she had no right to be here among those deemed elite, privileged. That remark felt like a flashback to the previous day when she had been thrown out of the first-class cabin, humiliated not just by a white passenger, but also by the airline staff. It had all felt like a nightmare, and now that sense of being diminished flared up in her chest once again. Isabel remained silent, but her very presence seemed to press down on the CEO and the entire room like an invisible weight. She walked calmly to her seat, unshaken, composed. Isabel knew that in the eyes of people like the CEO, she would always be considered someone out of place. But the truth was far from that. They didn't know that she was the owner of everything, the one with the power to make decisions with a single click. Her mere presence in that room was like a slap in the face to those who had always seen her as insignificant. Isabel didn't need to speak. Her mere existence in this meeting was enough to shatter all the misconceptions they had about her. Her silence in that moment was her most powerful retaliation. The room remained still, all eyes on her, but no one dared to resist because they understood one crucial thing. Isabel wasn't just a regular black woman. She was the secret owner of this airline, and no one could stop her in this fight. The CEO, despite his attempts to maintain a calm exterior, couldn't hide the unease creeping into his eyes. He knew that things were beginning to change, and he might very well be the one who would have to pay for his earlier acts of humiliation. Isabel stood there, her gaze like a blazing fire, unwavering. She looked at the CEO and the others in the room, but her eyes no longer held the silence of someone oppressed. In that moment, everything seemed to explode, an unstoppable force impossible to contain any longer. Her voice rang out, cold and full of resolve. "I'm terminating the entire executive team immediately." The words fell like an inevitable truth. There was no hesitation, no trace of weakness. Isabel was no longer the gentle woman in a simple suit. She was a woman of absolute power, a queen in this world. The people in the room were left stunned. The CEO, once the ruler here, now trembled. He sat there, unable to believe his ears. He couldn't understand why this was happening, but deep down, he felt an irremovable threat looming over him. You can't do this," the CEO shouted, his voice frantic, losing control. He waved his arms as if trying to smash everything before him, but then realized the futility of his actions. Isabel stood firm, completely unshaken. He clenched his teeth, twisting in an undeniable fear. No, you can't fire me. I built everything here. His voice grew weaker, the certainty he once held dissolving. Isabel didn't let him finish. "Shut up and leave the room," she coldly interrupted him without a moment's hesitation. The entire room was now motionless. The meeting participants dared not utter a word, their eyes locked as if asking themselves whether what was happening was just a dream. The CEO tried to hold on to what little pride he had left, but he couldn't stop himself from screaming, "I won't leave. I'm the CEO here. You're just some nameless woman with no power. You're a joke, an intruder," he shouted in a frenzy, but his eyes wavered as if he had begun to realize the harsh truth. Isabel didn't respond. She didn't need to. She simply looked at him, her eyes never leaving the CEO. "Then I'll help you." Isabel spoke softly, but each word crushed him like a stone, making it impossible for him to breathe. She only needed a wave of her hand. The security guards in the room immediately moved toward the CEO, swiftly removing him without a single word. Everything happened quickly, and no one could do anything to stop it. Isabel didn't need to say more, just stood there, her cold demeanor and undeniable power overwhelming the room. She had completely conquered not just the CEO, but the entire boardroom. When the door to the room closed behind him, Isabel sat down at the head of the table. Her voice echoed once more, but this time no one dared to resist. "Now, I will lead this company, and from now on, no one will disrespect me again." Everyone in the room understood that the game had changed. Isabel was no longer just a simple woman. She was the one with the power, the one who could not be defeated. The boardroom became suffocating, as if the air had been frozen. The attendees, from executives to long-standing shareholders, sat in silence, their eyes avoiding direct contact with Isabel. This stillness was nothing more than a facade for the raging anger simmering within each of them. Some eyes shifted nervously, others openly displayed contempt. But as the door closed, the atmosphere began to shift. Whispers rose from the seats behind her. No one dared to speak loudly, but every sound ignited the anger growing within them. These people were not accustomed to humiliation. They were used to power, to privilege, and now a woman stood before them, dismantling them with a simple decision. "She's just an imposter, nothing more than an old suit and a little money." A voice, low and filled with disdain, echoed from behind Isabel. A wealthy shareholder was clearly unable to endure her cold gaze. "But don't worry. We'll make her understand that she can't control this company." "A joke," another voice chimed in, quiet but full of venom. "We'll take back our power. We can't let her continue like this. She'll never be in charge of us." Isabel heard every word clearly, but she didn't turn around. She knew they were speaking about her, but didn't feel fear. Their whispers only fueled the fire of anger inside her. She refused to let them get to her, refused to let them discourage her. These sounds, though not loud, etched themselves into her mind. She knew this was just the beginning of a relentless battle. No matter how much power they held, they would never forgive this insult. She had embarrassed them, and they would strike back. But that was exactly Isabel's goal, not just to win, but to make them understand that true power did not come from wealth and status, but from resilience and justice. Instead of reacting immediately, Isabel remained silent, her expression unchanged, as if nothing was more important than the internal battle within herself. She let them continue their whispers, letting their anger and contempt rise to its peak. After a while, a shareholder stood up, his voice booming across the room. She thinks she can control everything just by waving her hand? We won't let her do that. I'll show her what real power looks like. Isabel said nothing, but her eyes flashed. This was the moment she would bring everything into the light. She had been prepared for this for a long time, not just with the courage of a woman, but with the intelligence and determination to see it through. The battle had just begun. After the shareholder meeting, Isabel braced herself for the challenges ahead, but she never anticipated how long this battle would drag on. The dirty tactics she faced weren't just snide comments or threats. They were much more insidious and cunning. Day by day, Isabel was forced to confront rumors spun by her enemies. Underhanded schemes were being carried out in the shadows, with bribed shareholders and secret contracts being signed, all with one singular purpose: to steal the company from her. Isabel soon realized that she wasn't just fighting racism. She was engaged in a financial battle she was ill-prepared for. She didn't know how she had been deceived. The shares she once controlled were now in the hands of her enemies. They had taken everything, stripping away the last bit of power she had. While Isabel struggled to find a way to turn the situation around, unexpected news segments spread like wildfire. The black failure loses everything. This news was widely broadcast on television, published in major newspapers, and shared at an alarming speed on social media. Isabel's story was no longer about a fight for justice, but had transformed into a bizarre tale of failure, a story deemed unnecessary by society's standards of what was undeserving. Those cruel words pierced her like daggers, embedding deep into her mind, leaving her feeling like she had nothing left to hold on to. As she tried to cling to the last vestiges of resilience, she couldn't ignore the sense of loss. Everything she had built over the years was crumbling in the blink of an eye. The company, the very entity she had poured her heart and soul into, now lay firmly in the hands of her enemies. A sense of despair washed over her, an overwhelming feeling of loneliness that only those who had fought with every ounce of their being could truly understand. But what angered her even more was the cruelty of her enemies, who not only robbed her of everything but also publicly humiliated her, leaving her with no shred of dignity. The media, press, and social media collectively criticized and dragged her down. Everyone looked at her as a failure, a person unable to overcome the challenges of society. Meanwhile, her enemies calmly reveled in their victory, sighing in relief as if they had solved the problem of a disappearing figure in the dark. But what Isabel didn't know was that this cruelty would become the spark that ignited a new battle, a battle she would fight to her last breath, not only to reclaim her company, but to prove that no one could easily discard her. Isabel stood before the iron gates of the company building, feeling the cold afternoon air cut into her skin. She stepped forward, gripping her handbag tightly, but inside her, there was nothing but despair. Everything was falling apart around her, yet she refused to give up. She walked toward her car, knowing there might not be many reasons left to keep going. As she left the parking area, a familiar sound reached her ears, shouts and mocking laughter. Isabel didn't turn around immediately, but when the laughter grew louder, she began to feel the tension building around her. A crowd had gathered at some point, standing packed on the sidewalk, their eyes full of hatred, fixated on her. "Who do you think you are?" a man's voice shouted from the crowd. The insults and jeers continued to ring out, making Isabel feel the hatred and pain in every word. "Get out of here. Don't think you can walk through here like a normal person." Isabel turned around, and the crowd of racists was surrounding her car, their abusive words growing more and more vulgar. A man stood close to her car, holding a box of matches, walking toward the luxury car Isabel had worked so hard to own. He smiled maliciously, his eyes filled with cruelty and hatred. Before she could react, the flames erupted. The crowd erupted in laughter, mocking her with scornful, derisive laughter as if they were watching a play and they were the victorious ones. Isabel stood there, helpless, watching her car burn brightly before her. The red of the flames reflected in her eyes like a mockery, harsh and unrelenting. She didn't have time to avoid the insults as the fire burned stronger, devouring everything she had worked so hard to build. But the most heartbreaking part was the indifference of the police officers standing at the scene. They stood not far away, looking at her and the crowd with apathetic eyes. No one moved to intervene. None of them spoke. They just stood there, a terrifying indifference worse than anything Isabel had ever imagined. One of the officers even mocked, as if what was happening in front of her was just a joke. He glanced at Isabel, then whispered something to his colleague, and they both laughed, their smiles full of provocation, making Isabel feel like she was being crushed under the indifference of the entire system. The crowd cheered, and the abusive words continued to echo. Isabel stood still, her hand gripping her handbag tightly, but her gaze was hollow. It wasn't the pain of losing her car. It was the unlimited contempt society had shown her. She knew that in their eyes, she wasn't human. She was just a symbol of failure, someone not deserving of respect. But deep inside, Isabel felt something the crowd and the indifferent bystanders couldn't see, anger rising within her, stronger than ever before. The fire burning her car wasn't just the crowd's revenge. It was a declaration of war, an irretrievable declaration. Violence had erupted, and Isabel would not turn back. The cold station, the concrete walls surrounding Isabel, made it hard for her to breathe. The damp bricks, the smell of cigarette smoke, and the gloom were all she could feel. The footsteps of security guards in the hallway echoed like the rapid beats of her heart. She couldn't believe she was here, in a prison, a place she once thought was reserved for those who had committed real crimes. But she, Isabel, had been pushed into this place by a diabolical scheme. Her mind spun as images from the previous day flooded her memory. A secret phone call from a close friend in the company had led her to a secluded area of the city, a place she never imagined. She had been lured into a meeting where drugs had been secretly planted in her handbag without her knowledge. She was arrested immediately, and all she could do was try to protect her honor, but it was all in vain. The police didn't listen to her explanations. No one cared about her side of the story. They focused only on the arrest warrant filled with fabricated evidence. You probably know the outcome by now, don't you? One of the officers standing nearby spoke with a cold and detached tone. Isabel didn't answer. She simply stood there, her heart pounding as if it would suffocate her. When she was thrown into the jail, the feeling of guilt and shame overwhelmed her. Her steps grew heavier. The eyes of those around her filled with coldness and contempt, as if she no longer deserved to be human. She was isolated from the other prisoners, confined to a small room where no one visited and no one stood up to protect her. However, one thing no one could take from her was her unwavering resilience. Her hands trembled as she sat down on the hard iron bed for the first time, her gaze fixed on the heavy iron door where darkness seemed to swallow her whole. But in that stillness, there was a flicker of light in her eyes, a spark of hope and determination. She knew that she couldn't be defeated by anything, even if the whole world turned its back on her. Every step in prison was a challenge, but she couldn't let those who set her up see that she had failed. Despair might make her falter, but she wouldn't let it control her life. She was still Isabel, the woman who had risen not just for herself, but for those oppressed, for those like her living in shame and injustice. Although she couldn't see the future clearly, there was still a fire of anger burning inside her, stronger than ever before. It was a defiance, a declaration of war she had never spoken aloud because she would never give up. In the suffocating atmosphere of the prison, the faint light from the flickering neon bulb cast eerie shadows on the cold walls. Isabel sat upright on the iron bed, her eyes fixed ahead, unwavering. The sound of footsteps echoed from a distance, each step quickening her heartbeat. A foreboding sensation settled in her chest. The door to her room creaked open, and a figure entered. It was Daniel, a former colleague, once a companion in the years of their shared battles. They had faced countless challenges together, rising side by side in a world rife with discrimination and injustice. But now, Daniel's appearance felt like a stab in the back. He stood still for a moment, his eyes refusing to meet Isabel's. His face was pale with fear, his hands trembling as he reached up to brush his messy hair. Suddenly, he dropped to his knees before Isabel, his face filled with desperation, his voice pleading. "I was forced to betray you." Daniel's voice shook, each word choked in his throat. "They threatened me, made me do it. I had no choice." The room fell into silence, but that silence only made the atmosphere heavier, more suffocating. Isabel felt the pain in his words, But what hurt more was the betrayal. A friend she had once trusted now standing before her with weak, cowardly apologies. Isabel didn't answer right away. She stood up and slowly walked to the window, where dim light filtered through the iron bars, casting a pale glow on her face. The sense of betrayal made her heart feel as though it were breaking. She had placed her trust in Daniel, a trust that meant so much, and now he had become a traitor. "Forgive you." Isabel finally spoke, her voice cold as ice, devoid of emotion. "Do you think I can forgive you, Daniel, after everything you've done? You sold me out for a threat. You think I'll just let you walk away like this?" Daniel stumbled to his feet, his eyes red and filled with regret. "I didn't know what else to do, Isabel. I really didn't want to do it, but they backed me into a corner. I had no choice." Isabel turned to face him, her gaze chilling and final. "You can leave. I don't need your apology. Traitors don't deserve a place in my life." Her words were like a knife to Daniel's heart, leaving him speechless. He turned and walked out of the room, but before he reached the door, he glanced back at Isabel. Her eyes were unwavering, showing no sign of regret. She had accepted a harsh truth. Not everyone deserves forgiveness. And in that moment, Isabel felt as though everyone around her, those who were once friends, those who were once comrades, had now abandoned her, leaving her alone in a fight with no way out. As Daniel left, the sound of the prison door slamming shut echoed, leaving Isabel standing silently in the cold room. His words still reverberated in her mind. Betrayal, a word that felt like a knife slicing through her soul. But instead of letting the emotions take over, Isabel merely smiled coldly. She knew that those who betrayed her would eventually pay the price. Looking back at the days leading up to this, Isabel vividly remembered every moment she had spent preparing for this revenge. It wasn't always possible to act immediately, and she knew that well. Everything had to be meticulously planned. She had prepared for everything long before. During her time working, Isabel had quietly gathered evidence, documenting every conversation, every secret meeting, every word spoken by the shareholders and the CEO. Every encounter where they thought they could manipulate her, she recorded with precision. Each audio clip, each video, each piece of evidence had become a sharp tool in her revenge plan. Looking back, Isabel didn't feel regret. On the contrary, her anger grew stronger as she recalled the private conversations, the lies they had told about her. Those who thought she wasn't capable of standing up to them would soon realize how wrong they were. She wouldn't just expose them, she would make them pay. And now, sitting here in prison, her eyes no longer held confusion or weakness. She was resilient, determined, and every step she took brought her closer to the day she would reveal the truth to the world. Everything Isabel had done, whether in the shadows or right in front of her enemies, had been calculated. The video footage she had collected would be the weapon that would leave everyone stunned. Every meeting, every gathering held undeniable proof. Every word, every action of those who had betrayed her would be brought to light and could no longer be concealed. With this evidence, Isabel would make them all pay. And when the time came, justice would be served, and all those who had betrayed her would not escape the punishment she had long been preparing for them. The light in the cell was dim. Only the faint sounds of chains clinking together filled the air. Isabel sat motionless, but inside her, a storm was brewing. The days of imprisonment hadn't weakened her resolve. Instead, they had made her more determined than ever. Suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. Isabel wasn't someone who lacked awareness. She could sense danger instantly. The enemies were making their move. The traitor outside couldn't bear the truth that was about to be exposed. A key witness had stepped forward, preparing to give damning testimony, and the enemies knew they couldn't let that happen. At that moment, in the stillness of the prison, Isabel felt a surge of tension fill the air. The enemies were panicking, orders were given, and everything started spiraling out of control. They were desperately scrambling to silence the witness, resorting to any means necessary. They were willing to do anything to stop the truth from coming out. But there was one thing they didn't know. It was already too late. Isabel clenched her fists, a bitter smile curling on her lips. Every detail she had meticulously prepared was now set to become an irreparable wound for them. The witness had found the courage to speak up, and no amount of pressure could silence them. The enemy's resistance could no longer reach her. She knew this battle was no longer just about her. It had gone beyond the control of those in power. And now, it was time for everyone to face the consequences that were unavoidable. Everything Isabel had quietly prepared was now waiting for the right moment to overturn everything. While the chaos unfolded outside, Isabel sat still in her cell, feeling an invisible force growing stronger by the second. This was the moment when all the plans, all the calculations would begin to crumble. Those who thought they could control the situation, silence the truth, were now about to face a resistance so fierce they couldn't have imagined. The entire prison seemed to freeze. Each passing second was filled with intense anticipation. Everyone was waiting, but one thing was certain: justice was closer than ever before. After all the brutal schemes began to unfold, Isabel, the woman who had been torn down and humiliated, now stood strong in the face of the furious gaze in the courtroom. Her act of revenge was not just a response to those who had destroyed her life, but a pursuit of justice, a restoration of dignity for the oppressed. The screen in the courtroom suddenly lit up, showing the video Isabel had carefully collected. The dark scenes, the painful moments she had faced, were now exposed to the public. The image of police officers laughing, mocking her, echoed through the courtroom. Those who, instead of upholding justice, stood alongside the racists, participating in this public assault. The video continued to play, and now the CEO, the mastermind behind the racist conspiracy, appeared. He sat in a private room, sneering and making disparaging remarks about Isabel, as if his actions had no consequences. But now, everything was laid bare before the jury and the audience in the courtroom. The crowd in the video continued to attack, setting fire to her car in the middle of the street while the police looked on indifferently. These images were not just brutal acts, but a public humiliation of Isabel. She, who had once been pushed aside, disrespected, and treated as undeserving, was now the central figure in a grand story of justice. The jury could no longer remain calm. They exchanged looks, their eyes filled with confusion. The evidence before them was so clear that no one could deny it. Anger spread throughout the room. The criminals had nowhere left to hide. Their brutal actions had been exposed, undeniable. During all of this, Isabel sat quietly, her eyes cold yet resolute. She didn't need to speak anymore. Everything was clear. She wasn't just there to seek justice for herself, but to avenge all those who had been discriminated against, pushed to the margins of society. The cruelty of the powerful had been shattered. She would not allow anyone to escape their reckoning. The scene in the courtroom was no longer just about Isabel's personal battle. It was the fight of all the oppressed, all those who had been despised, all those who had endured racial discrimination throughout their lives. Justice would be served, and this revenge was not just for personal satisfaction, but a liberation for all those who had suffered. The story had reached its climax. This revenge would not only be a lesson for those in power, but a statement to all who had been treated unjustly that justice would always prevail. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath in the tense stillness as the verdict was read. Isabel stood firm, her hands gripping the wooden table, her gaze unwavering, not the slightest tremor in her eyes. Those who had once humiliated her, who had tried to push her into the abyss, now faced a retribution they could never have imagined. The courtroom was dead silent, every eye fixed on Isabel, watching her every move. The jury had no choice but to announce, "Isabel Moreau is acquitted." The words rang out, and it was as if the entire space was sliced through, a wave of relief sweeping over the room. But what stunned everyone even more was what happened next. Without hesitation, Isabel stood, her cold eyes flashing like lightning in a storm. She stared directly at the enemies who had once mocked her, who had treated her as unworthy of existence in this society. With a voice stronger than any before, she declared, "I will take everything back." It was not just a vow, but a ruthless assertion in Isabel's voice. Each word she uttered struck like a direct blow to those who had stolen everything from her: her honor, her power, her freedom, and her belief in justice. Her voice was wild with fury, but also resolute with purpose. The people standing before her, from former business partners to the racists in her life, no longer held any power. Isabel had overcome everything, not just to stand strong, but to prove to everyone who had ever looked down on her that everything would be reclaimed by her own hand. The coldness in her eyes was not just revenge, it was an unwavering determination. She would not stop until everything was returned to her, and those who caused her suffering paid a steep price. All eyes were on Isabel, but she didn't care. She knew what would come next. Ruthless justice, like a crashing wave, would wash away all obstacles and push the guilty to the farthest edge of reckoning. After declaring her unwavering resolve, Isabel turned and walked out of the courtroom, but she knew that this was only the beginning. As she left the courthouse, a tidal wave began to rise within the enemies who had once believed themselves untouchable. The CEO and the old executive team began to realize that everything was changing, and they no longer had control. An urgent call came in from the CEO, the man who had once seen her as weak, easily crushed. His trembling hand reached for the phone, his eyes glued to the message Isabel had just sent. On the other end, desperate pleas began to spill out, but Isabel's calm acceptance of total control made their words meaningless. "Isabel, please. We can make a deal. Don't do this. I'll do whatever it takes to help you." The CEO's voice cracked with fear, shaking uncontrollably. She stared at the phone screen, a smirk tugging at her lips. There was no pity in that smile, only coldness and absolute certainty about what she was about to do. "A deal." She spoke with a calmness that carried immense weight. "No, I don't need anything from you anymore. You're far too late." With a single press of a button, Isabel ended the call without a shred of mercy. The small beep of the phone disconnecting was a definitive confirmation that she had severed all ties with those who had once brought her down. On the other end, the CEO was in panic. His hands were slick with sweat. "Isabel, I'm sorry. We can fix everything. We can start over." But no one could hear him anymore. He was left with nothing but a sense of hopelessness, like a fish stranded on land, flailing for an escape he knew he couldn't find. With each passing second, the panic within the CEO and the executive team grew. They began to realize that begging and pleading were worthless. Their pleas had turned into faint echoes, incapable of salvaging anything. Isabel had struck, and everything began to crumble before their eyes. 2 days later, Isabel entered the auction room, moving slowly, deliberately, with a confidence that made every step she took impossible to ignore. The spotlight illuminated her, casting a glow that made her presence undeniable. From the moment she entered, she captured every eye in the room. This was not just any auction. It was a statement from a woman who had been knocked down but now stood tall, ready to fight to reclaim what had been taken from her. In the days leading up to this, the whispers about Isabel among the upper class had never ceased. The insults, the disdainful glances, every one of them was directed at her as she walked into the room. In such a short time, Isabel had gone from being a discarded woman to a formidable opponent that no one had expected. Those who had boycotted and belittled her now had to face the truth, and this truth would change everything. As Isabel stood before the cameras, all eyes turned to her. The people who had once laughed at her, seeing her as a loser, were now on edge. It wasn't just because she was black, but because of the resilience and determination she exuded. But the looks from the elite were no longer filled with disdain. Now they were laced with caution. "She's here again? What can she possibly do except watch us bid? She surely doesn't have the money. A woman like her? What's she even doing here? She's just a relic of the past." Their voices echoed openly, unrestrained, as if Isabel didn't deserve their attention. But she stood there, unfazed by the insults. She simply smiled, a smile not of kindness but of ruthlessness, a subtle warning that she was ready to face whatever came her way. When the auction officially began, Isabel didn't rush or hurry. She stood there, calm, as though she held all the power in the room. Because for Isabel, it wasn't about money or influence. It was about asserting her existence in this world. When her turn came, Isabel spoke up, her voice firm. "I'll buy back the entire company." All eyes turned to her. No one could ignore the words she had just spoken. The elite were stunned, unable to believe what was happening. But Isabel wasn't just standing there to bid. She was the one who would change the game. And then, everyone looked at her differently, no longer with contempt but with suspicion, with weariness. Isabel didn't just have money. She had a plan and an unwavering resolve that no one could comprehend. The upper class, the most powerful people in society, now faced an Isabel who was no longer a victim but a willing participant in this battle. And in this auction, they would come to realize that they were not the ones determining Isabel's fate. The auction room fell silent, the only sound being the click of keyboards as the numbers on the screen began to climb higher and higher. Isabel stood at the center of the room, completely unfazed. The light from the overhead lamps highlighted her, reflecting a fierce determination in her every step. With each button she pressed, the company's value skyrocketed, surpassing every expectation of the elite. Those who had once dismissed her, the upper class in the room, began to whisper among themselves, their fragmented voices growing louder. Their eyes could hardly believe what was happening. No one had imagined that Isabel, a woman they once thought unworthy of their attention, could pull this off. A woman they had ridiculed and cast aside was now poised to own everything they considered untouchable. When the auction finally ended, The price had exceeded what anyone could have imagined. Isabel had won. She had not only won the auction, but she had also won the battle in which she had once been defeated. Her enemies, those who had mocked her, who had humiliated her, were now faced with themselves. Their downfall was not just a financial loss. It was a devastating blow to their pride. All eyes were on Isabel, but no one dared to speak. She turned, raised her hand, and signaled for her staff to enter the room. Every eye in the room fixed on her. Each step Isabel took was like a psychological strike against her opponents. She stood there like a conqueror, unwavering. From the look in her eyes, it was clear she was the embodiment of cold determination, someone who had persevered for years just to reach this moment. Isabel stopped in front of the CEO. He stood there, pale-faced, his hands trembling with an obvious fear he couldn't hide. He had once laughed at her, called her a failure, claimed she didn't deserve to step into first class. Now, he was forced to face the retribution he could do nothing to change. "You think I'll stop now?" Isabel said, her voice icy, each word resonating clearly in the tense room. The CEO dropped to his knees, his face contorted, his voice ragged. "Please don't do this. I was wrong. I'll change. We can start over. I'll help you." But Isabel didn't respond. She just looked down at him, her eyes deep and empty of emotion. She didn't need forgiveness from the ones who had humiliated her, and she certainly didn't need their fake apologies. She stepped forward, unyielding, and kicked the chair aside, revealing the scratches on the floor as a harsh warning. The room was stunned. No one dared to make a sound. They watched a woman they had once pushed to the brink, disrespected, now standing at the pinnacle. She hadn't just won this auction. She had defeated all those who had ever belittled her. The CEO's pleas were now nothing more than empty cries, and Isabel had no interest in them. She turned her back, watching her staff continue their work. They knew that today wasn't just about her getting the company back. It was the day she reclaimed the power she had always deserved. The air was thick with anticipation as Isabel's enemies realized there was nowhere left for them to hide. The upper class and the shareholders in the auction room no longer felt invincible. They began to understand that Isabel wasn't just a formidable opponent. She was someone who would never forgive those who had wronged her. A perfect revenge. And they knew that in the future, no one would dare to underestimate her again. Isabel stood there in the center of the vast room, the spotlight shining directly onto her face, casting a shadow behind her that stretched across the room like an ominous figure. All eyes were on her. Those who had once scorned her, those who had sought to bring her down, now had to face a change that was irreversible. She didn't need to speak. Her silent presence, her unyielding and cold demeanor, was enough to leave everyone speechless. Isabel's gaze was wide, but it radiated an irresistible strength, like a flame rising in the darkness of the night. She was the embodiment of vengeance, no longer weak, no longer forgiving those who had pushed her to the edge. A wave of anger exploded within her, but strangely, it didn't weaken her. Instead, it transformed into an overwhelming source of power. Anger had taught her how to survive, how to rise after every fall. The burdens she once carried on her shoulders now became the driving force that propelled her forward with more strength than ever before. In a brief moment, she looked at each person who had once insulted her. Her gaze was cold and sharp as a blade, and it made everyone hold their breath. It was as if she was seeing through them, seeing through all the schemes and conspiracies they had crafted to bring her down. A woman alone, yet she possessed a power no one could have imagined. As she walked out of the auction room, no one dared to speak. Everything around her seemed to fade into the background, as though she was standing at the peak of a world apart, where only vengeance and justice reigned. No one could stop her, for she had become a symbol of resistance against injustice, of ruthless vengeance. The ones left behind could only sense the strange shift in the air, the powerful change in how Isabel viewed the world. She was no longer the weak woman in simple clothes. She was a warrior of justice, a warrior who had endured all suffering to stand tall on her own 2 feet. The audience couldn't take their eyes off the screen. They didn't just sympathize with her. They felt proud of the strength she had displayed. What she had gone through, what she had endured, was now in the past, and the future belonged to her. She wasn't just avenging those who had humiliated her. She was sending a message to all those who had ever been oppressed. Anger can be transformed into power, and that power can change the world. And in that very moment, Isabel was no longer alone. She had risen not just for herself, but for all those enduring injustice in this world. She was a living testament to the power of anger when distilled into determination. The scene in the courtroom could not have been more still. All eyes were fixed on Isabel as she stepped up to the podium, where once she had stood trembling with fear. But today, she was an entirely different woman, a sleek black suit, hair neatly tied back, her gaze as cold as steel. She was no longer the weak woman crushed by the cruelty of the upper class. Isabel's voice rang out, wild yet resolute. "I do not forgive. I do not forget. This is the justice of the humiliated." These words were not just a declaration of war against those who had wronged her, but a powerful affirmation that she would never let them escape the consequences of their actions. Each word Isabel spoke struck like a hammer against the hearts of those who had once thought they could trample over others without paying a price. The entire room fell silent. Not a sound was to be heard, only the heavy sighs of those watching in disbelief. These words weren't just about Isabel. They were a call to all those who had been oppressed, looked down upon, a new declaration about justice and revenge. After Isabel's declaration, all that remained was the collapse of her enemies. The CEO, who had once boasted of his wealth and power, now had to endure the most crushing humiliation. Piece by piece, his career was torn apart. His relationships with the elite crumbled as they turned their backs on him. He was left with nothing but shame and fear. The audience watched as he lost his reputation, once considered the pinnacle of society, now a mere shadow devoid of value. Newspapers filled with headlines decrying him. Racist CEO, the man Isabel took down. The racist crowd, the ones who had stood behind the cruel actions, were now being prosecuted. The police began investigating incidents of discrimination, car burnings, and the cruelty Isabel had endured. No one could fathom the suffering she had gone through, but now her revenge became a lesson for society on fairness and human rights. Isabel had not only regained justice for herself, but had sparked a major change in the community, where those who thought they could manipulate others' fates would have to pay the price. The downfall of her enemies was the triumph of justice. Finally, Isabel stood on top of a skyscraper where once she had witnessed her world fall apart. Now standing there, she wasn't just looking down at the city. She was seeing the light from the shadows she had overcome. Her gaze, though still bearing a trace of tremor, now held unwavering resolve and unshakable strength. She had conquered every storm, overcome disdain, pain, and betrayal. Her eyes were no longer filled with fear, no longer weak. They held the power of someone who had risen from the ashes, someone who had come back to claim their existence. The audience could feel the strength radiating from Isabel. Her resurrection wasn't just her own. It was for all those who had been trampled, who had been left behind in the dark. Isabel had not only defeated those who had harmed her, she had created a wave of change, a wave that all racists and oppressors would have to face. She was the symbol of rebirth, a living testament to those who believe in justice and the power of resistance. Life is never without challenges, and each challenge presents an opportunity for us to rise. Sometimes you will face discrimination, injustice, and hardships that seem insurmountable. However, always remember that strength doesn't come from avoiding difficulties, but from the ability to stand up every time you fall. Never let pain or hurt make you surrender. Turn every failure into motivation to move forward. Find opportunities in adversity and create change, not only for yourself, but also for those around you. Justice is not something you simply receive. Justice is something you create through action, through determination, and through the courage to rise even when the world is pushing you down. When you persist in pursuing your goals, when you trust in your own abilities, you will not only defeat the enemies outside, but also conquer the doubts and fears within. Always remember, we are never weaker than when we stand up to fight for what is right. So, no matter how difficult life may be, never lose faith in yourself, because every step you take in the dark, every act of resistance against injustice, brings you one step closer to the light of freedom and justice. Thank you so much for following this journey with me. Your support means everything, and I hope this story has inspired you to stand up for what's right, no matter the odds. The fight for justice is never easy, but with determination, we can all create a better world for ourselves and others. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so you can join me on more emotional journeys like this one. Let's keep spreading the message of resilience, justice, and empowerment. Your voice matters, and together, we can make a difference. Stay strong, stay bold, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for being part of this incredible community.